Okay, so I'll begin formally. So everyone, welcome to this webinar hosted by the 21st Century China Center at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. As many of you know, GPS offers several master's degree programs to students all over the world, including one that focuses exclusively on the study of China, which is the Master of Chinese Economic and Political Affairs program, the MCPA program. We are on the cusp right now of welcoming a new class of MCPA students, so I'm very excited about that. Most of you know I'm Victor Shih. I'm the Ho Mu Lam Chair in China and Pacific Relations at UC San Diego at GPS. My research interests are the politics of China's fiscal and financial policies, as well as elite politics of China. I'll put a quick plug into my new book. I have a forthcoming book next month, which is called Coalitions of the Weak, which is on how coalition formation during the late Mao period shaped politics in China for decades to come, including the rise of Xi Jinping. So I urge you to keep a lookout for that. Today, we're very happy to have Isaac Stonefish joining us to discuss his new book, which is called America Second: How America's Elites Are Making China Stronger. Isaac, whom I've known for quite a number of years, is a contributing columnist at the Washington Post, a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council, an on-air contributor to CBSN, and author of a column on China risks for Barron's. A fluent Mandarin speaker, Isaac lived in Beijing for 6 years and visited every Chinese province, autonomous region, and municipality. That's pretty impressive. He's also a term member of the Council for Foreign Relations, a Truman National Security Fellow, an alumni of the World Economic Forum, Global Shaper Program, and the CEO and founder of his own consulting practice, which is called Strategy Risks. After a brief presentation, I will start a conversation with him, and then I'll open up for Q&A. Again, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions, which I'm going to read out during the Q&A portion. Without further ado, welcome to UCSD virtually, of course, Isaac.
Victor, thank you for having me. So I'll start with just a very quick overview of the book, and then very excited to be in conversation with you about it. So I started thinking about America Second after coming back to the States from Beijing and finding that so many prominent Americans would speak about China, not the way that Chinese people would, but the way that Chinese party elite would. And they would repeat these phrases. China has 5,000 years of history. China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. China only wants peace. And the issue with these phrases is not their veracity, but the sloganing weight of them. And a little bit later, I would think of comparisons between those phrases and the phrase "all lives matter." So 15 years ago, if you say "all lives matter," it wouldn't be controversial at all. You're just making a humanist statement. Today, if you say "all lives matter," you're pushing back against Black Lives Matter, you're repeating a Trumpist, or at the very least, a Republican talking point, and you're making what in a lot of circles is a very pointed political statement. And so I wanted to understand how it was that Americans were speaking about China in this way and how the language policies happened. And that just opened up a really big door. And the book focuses on 3 areas. One is Hollywood. The second is the DC foreign policy business elite. And the third is universities. So I'll talk a little bit about all of them. I'll talk a little bit about my last chapter, which is, how do we push back without being McCarthyist or racist? How do you do this with having a world where, in the words of Jack Chen, who runs the Museum of Chinese America, who I interviewed for the book, that, when Alan Dershowitz says something stupid, he's not accused of dual loyalty. He's just accused of saying something that's silly. He's Jewish. He's not, people don't think he's an Israeli spy. How do we get to the point where there's a similar dynamic with Chinese Americans? So, get to that a little bit in the end, but first talk a little bit about Hollywood. So Hollywood today is one of, if not the most pro-Beijing sector of US society, and certainly the most pro-Beijing sector of US businesses. And this all has an origin story, and that comes from 1997, Annus Horribilis for China's relationship with Hollywood. That year, Hollywood studios released 3 films that Beijing decided to find offensive. Red Corner, Richard Gere potboiler about a lawyer who gets trapped in the Chinese justice system. Then 2 films about Tibet, 7 Years in Tibet with Brad Pitt, and Kundun, directed by Martin Scorsese. This came at a time when Beijing was trying to recalibrate how it exerted influence in the United States. It happened right after the Chinagate scandal, mostly forgotten today, but it was a massive political scandal in the mid-1990s where the director of Chinese military intelligence gave several $100,000 to a Democratic bundler to try to re-elect Clinton, which is illegal under US law. And it was the scandal of the Clinton White House until Monica Lewinsky came in and upended the scandal hierarchy. So Beijing was realizing that directly giving money for political influence was not effective. And 1997 in these 3 films allowed them to try a different way of narrative and agenda setting in the United States. And what they did is they banned the studios that made the films, didn't explicitly say why they were banning, and slowly but surely gave them a way out of that banning by admitting their mistakes, doing a self-criticism, basically, writing a 揭发信, and kowtowing, apologizing, and getting back in. So Disney owned Miramax at the time, and the CEO of Disney, 1998, goes, meets with Zhurongji, apologizes for the film, said it was a huge embarrassment, and says, we won't do this again. And what happens, Disney is in many ways a standard setter. Other Hollywood studios understood the same phenomena, and there was this long, protracted process over the next 15 years, roughly 1997, 1998 to 2012, where studios learned how to develop in the back of their mind this little voice that would say, okay, well, is Beijing going to be offended by this? There's a lot of trial and error. So Memoirs of a Geisha came out, I think, in 2005. Studios thought, oh, this is going to be a big hit in China. We're going to cast Chinese actresses in prominent roles. Beijing's going to love it. Well, Memoirs of a Geisha is about Japan, and they cast Chinese actresses as Japanese. That didn't go over very well. All sorts of little trial and error. But you get to a point where by 2013, I think it was, the film The Departed with Jack Nicholson and Mark Wahlberg, which has a very, very small subplot of bad guys from Hong Kong, or gangsters from Hong Kong. And that is the last major studio film that has any portrayal that could be deemed critical by Beijing. And we're in a situation now where the portrayal of China in American movies is cartoonishly unrealistic. And I remember one of my last trips to China going and seeing Wolf Warrior 2 in a movie theater in Chongqing. Have you seen that, Victor? Yeah, it's
Yes. Oh, is it the yes, I have seen that before.
Yeah. So it's very jingoistic. It's embarrassing. It's basically a Chinese special forces op goes to Africa and saves the Africans from themselves. Very patronizing. But in the beginning of the film, this guy fights against rapacious Chinese real estate developers to defend a martyr's tomb. And I remember seeing that and thinking, oh, rapacious Chinese real estate developers, negative portrayals of Chinese characters. You can't do that in a Hollywood movie. There's not been a Hollywood movie that's done anything like that, since 2013 and before. And so we're in a situation now where American films are more careful about their portrayal of China than Chinese films are. It's very, very different from television and from music, two industries that show that you can have freedom of expression when it comes to China, and we can get into that a little bit later. But a lot of the book talks about how Hollywood got to what it is today and why that's problematic. The DC Business Nexus area looks at the role that former senior foreign policy officials played, national security advisors, secretaries of state, or as is the case with Kissinger, who I talk about at length in the book, someone who held both roles. And I look at how they kept influencing policy while making a lot of money as business leaders and not disclosing that they were doing both at once. And I don't want to cast aspersions on the idea of going into business. I mean, I run a business now. I'm a consultant. The work that I do and the business that I run influences the way that I think about China, the way that I talk about China, the way that I talk about a lot of other things. The issue is that since Henry Kissinger founded his consulting company, Kissinger Associates, in 1982, he was a businessman first and a policy guru second. But Kissinger's brilliance and his deep entrenchment in the China field means that people would trust him as giving impartial advice, as opposed to giving advice that would be beneficial to him and the party, and often to the detriment of US interests. And certainly not just Kissinger. Kissinger was the most prominent. It was bipartisan. Madeleine Albright ran a consulting company. William Cohen, Clinton's defense secretary, bragged that he left office on a Friday and opened up for business on a Monday. It's this idea that somehow these people can, unlike anyone else in human history, compartmentalize perfectly the foreign policy advice that they're giving and the business that they're doing. So I talk about that with them. I talk about that with George H.W. Bush, who did a lot of business in China in the 90s and the 2000s. And I talk about the impact that has on our understanding of China all the way from the 80s to the present. Universities is a more difficult subject to talk about. Universities have such a higher standard of intellectual inquiry, but at the same time, because they have that higher standard, and because they perform, and they're supposed to perform a lot more ethically than businesses do, examples of self-censorship, examples of ethical compromises are a lot more pointed, and the critique is a lot more important because we expect universities to allow people to act and think in a way that's relatively or entirely free from influence. So I talk a lot about censorship and self-censorship at universities. I talk about the role that Chinese students play and don't play in those. I talk about my support for Confucius Institutes. I do feel like they're a distraction from the bigger debate, and B, I'm very worried that people are not able to learn Chinese. And I'm not worried about people at Harvard or Yale or UCSD. I'm worried about people at University of New Mexico, University of New Hampshire, smaller, less well-funded schools where the option is Confucius Institute or no one learns Chinese. And I don't know if this was when you learned Chinese, Victor, but my textbook, we learned how to say cadre and production brigade before we learned how to say sleep and drink. And there's these, the communist ways of speaking that people from Hong Kong or Taiwan will sometimes claim, look how they are degrading the Chinese language, but that's the way that a lot of people talk in China. There's some very key vocabulary or language patterns that you have to learn. And yeah, I would always think, if the choice between not learning Chinese and learning from a Confucius Institute, fantastic. I was also very worried when Tufts University canceled their Confucius Institute to say, we're going to focus more on our partnership with, I think it was Beijing Capital University or Beijing Normal University. And that to me is more problematic than working with the Confucius Institute. It's a partnership that has a lot less scrutiny. Victor, I see you.
I have a quick anecdote here for you. Yeah. So I'm a native Cantonese speaker. So I did take Mandarin Chinese in college just so I can learn Mandarin Chinese. My first textbook, the second lesson, was about this Uyghur guy called Afanti. And the whole lesson was about how the strong friendship between the Uyghurs and the Han Chinese and the respect for Uyghur customs. And this was a textbook that was printed in mainland China to teach non-native speakers of Chinese, interestingly.
That is very interesting and very sad in hindsight. So I talk about that with universities, and I also talk about, my experiences self-censoring when I was a journalist in Beijing and even later. And I believe the goal is not to say, I don't censor, I don't self-censor, but the goal is to be honest with oneself, say, this is when I censor, this is why, and not to pretend it's not censorship, but these are the ethical compromises that I'm making to engage. I got very frustrated at NYU Shanghai. I think there was an assistant dean, I think several years ago, who said something like, yeah, we're going to open a campus and we're going to have the same level of academic freedom in the United States that we do in China that we do in the United States. And that's a lie. You can't do that in China, period, end. And for people to say things like that, I feel like is very dangerous and misleading for American students who want to go to China and who want to express themselves and have freedom of inquiry. It's not possible. It's not that China is absolutely not free and the United States is absolutely free. It's that they're on a continuum. China is far less free. There are places and areas where it's more free, but broadly speaking, it's less. And so the idea is, okay, in order to go and flourish here are the sacrifices you have to make. Here's broadly speaking, the way that the censorship apparatus works. Here's the way that you'll be constrained. We still feel like it's a very valuable experience for you to go for these reasons, but we're not going to lie to you and make you pretend that it's going to be the same thing as having a debate about the Uyghur genocide, publicly on campus in the United States. And I think about it somewhat comparably to if a university is sending an openly gay student to Saudi Arabia, they're not going to say, like, go, you do you. Everything here is exactly the same as the United States, and we're very proud of your pride. They're going to say, listen, this is illegal under Saudi law, and here's how this could play out there. We don't support these laws. We don't want this to be this way, but we feel like we have the duty to prepare you and say, if you still want to go, these are some of the things that could happen. So I think universities have that moral responsibility towards the students who want to go. We'll see what things look like post-COVID, because it's not really a possibility to go now anyway. We'll see how much things change between now and then. I think it's a similar idea with Chinese students in class. I think a lot about the University of Minnesota student who tweeted things about Shih, I believe in the United States, went back to China and was arrested, and the duty of the professor of that class. Because if you're talking to American passport holders and they're asking about your opinion of Xi Jinping, they're asking about freedom of expression, you do want to be able to support people to have a free and open dialogue about, is Xi a dictator? Is he not? Should people push against the party? Should the party be ruling China? But these questions, especially when you have certain Chinese students in your class who might inform on other Chinese students, can be dangerous. And so then there's the question of, do you as a professor censor views that you would say in other audiences in order to protect your students? I think a lot of times the answer to that should be yes. And I think there are plenty of examples when censorship can be ethical, but I also want to discourage people from saying, oh, I wasn't censoring, I was just protecting my students. No, you were censoring to protect your students. And that can be very, very ethical, but understand that you're doing that so we don't lose sight of what these words mean. Final point, and then we'll hop into questions. So at the end of the book, I talk about the case of Chen Xuesen, who was a absolutely brilliant rocket scientist, almost Oppenheimer level brilliant, who made great contributions to the World War II weapons program. And after the war, in the McCarthyist panic, was seen as a Chinese agent, a Chinese spy, and sent back to a China that was very eager to develop its own weapons program. And Chen made two large contributions to Chinese society. One was its nuclear weapon program, and the second, very sadly, was his well-publicized support to Mao Zedong's close planting idea during the beginning of the Great Leap Forward. So there's a lot of reasons why China descended into madness in the Great Leap Forward. There's a lot of people who are a lot more culpable than Chen, but it was an atrocity that he committed by praising Mao at that point, one of the great luminaries of Chinese science. And so the US bears responsibility for that, for expelling someone for what seems to be absolutely innocuous ties to China. And it was a massive ethical and strategic mistake that the US did and committed. And I think there's a lot of parallels with that today. There's not enough of an understanding on both sides of the aisle, but probably especially on the Republican side, about how discriminating against Chinese or Chinese Americans, not only, if you leave the ethics entirely aside, which I never think you should, but, for the purpose of this conversation, if you just focus on the strategy, it strengthens Beijing because it allows Beijing to claim, we are the government that protects Chinese people globally. Look at how the United States treats people. Look at the very real problems with racism in the United States. And I think people need to understand this issue from that as well. And I know, Victor, we'll talk about the China initiative more, but that was done incredibly poorly. And it was a very, very clumsy attempt to fix a problem. And the way it needs to be done is to focus on issues of corruption and national security as opposed to race-linked research leaks. So a lot more Charles Lieblers and a lot less innocent MIT professors. Again, alleged for Lieber. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing your questions and chatting with you about this.
Well, thank you, Isaac. Sounds like a very interesting book, and I definitely look forward to diving into it. So my first question is why did you title your book America as Number Two? Given the kind of stories that you talk about, it is a bit, somewhat about the fear of Chinese influence or Chinese government influence and pressure on different entities in the US, but also a fear of US reaction. How do these different dynamics potentially can lead to an America that falls from being, the number one economy or geopolitical power in the world?
So a couple of reasons. Russian influence globally is a lot more about chaos for chaos's sake, and Beijing's influence is a lot more about changing the way that people think about China. And the more powerful China gets, the more important the views of China matter. I think you could argue it's similar with North Korean influence. North Korea really wants you to change the way you think about North Korea, but because North Korea is so unsubstantial to US daily life, it doesn't really matter. But China is the country that jeopardizes US global dominance. China is the country that jeopardizes US hegemony in Asia. And I think people can make plenty of really smart points about why the US shouldn't be a hegemon and why we should be in a bipolar world. But for those who don't agree with those points and who believe that the world and the United States is better suited by a US-led global order as opposed to a Chinese-led global order, we need to have a conversation about what to do about Beijing's rise, its global influence, and how to push back in an ethical and strategic way. I also joke that, if there, there's not going to be a mainland title, there'll be a mainland version, there'll be a Taiwanese version, and they could just, call it 美国很二, which means America is defective, like two in Beijing slang means defective. But I think the idea is not that Beijing influence sets out to weaken America. It's about American acquiescence. And it's about presenting this idea that China is A, entirely peaceful, B, still rising, and C, its rise is inevitable and unstoppable. So putting these ideas out at the same time and making people think, well, this is going to happen anyway, so we should increase our trade links and we don't have to worry about any sort of military reaction or any sort of war because China is a peaceful nation and has never been at war, which, somehow people tend to think, but, forget about the many wars that China has fought in its history.
So the strongest linkage there I see is through this kind of DC elite who are, of course, these white men. I guess we can say the majority of them are these white men. But then on, in defense of these old white men, as you know, a lot of this kind of DC consultancy, they're consulting oftentimes US businesses, sometimes they're Chinese businesses or Japanese businesses, but US businesses that are trying to set up production or sales in China. if the China market wasn't so promising, if the cost structure of producing goods in China wasn't so economically efficient, you wouldn't have these business opportunities for these old white guys to profit from this. I mean, don't you think a lot of this has to do with China's, relatively successful first economic reform, and more recently, maybe even some of the impact of the industrial policies? And the best response to that is not to say, oh, you evil old white guys, stop lobbying for Beijing, but instead to sort of improve our own, industrial capacity, education and science and math, et cetera, et cetera.
I think that whatever strategy the US takes, what you said needs to happen. I don't think I don't think it can be done in isolation. And I worry about strategies that don't address the problem head on. And I think in a lot of cases, it's a problem of corruption and conflicts of interest. Because in the legal field, in the financial services field, there are very clear rules about conflicts of interest. And people still violate them all the time. And there's still a big swamp. And it's not like these fields are paradigms of ethics, but this is when you recuse yourself from something. This is what you can do. This is what you can't do. And, there was a case maybe about 12 years ago with Brent Scowcroft and his firm. He was a former national security advisor. He's a senior DC official, and he was running a firm, and the firm sued this firm for not paying them. And what were they paying them for? Well, Scowcroft wrote a letter to someone that he worked with while he was in government saying, you should let this American firm, or Canadian firm perhaps it was, buy this Turkish firm, buy this Turkish asset. And that to me feels inappropriate for Scowcroft to go say things publicly praising the US-Turkish relationship while doing that. One of my favorite other non-China examples, Kissinger, right after Indonesia transitioned to a democracy, appointed himself a special advisor of the Indonesian president. Why? In Kissinger's words, because he really loves the US-Indonesia relationship and he wants to support Indonesian transition to democracy. However, at the same time, Kissinger was on the board of Freeport-McMoRan, this very large Anglo-Australian mining company that was in the process of renegotiating a stake with a local Indonesian government. And it just baffles me that he was allowed to do that, and that people would believe that he was doing that for the good of the US-Indonesian relationship, as opposed to for the good of Kissinger and the clients for which he worked. So I think there is more severe lobbying restraints that need to be put in place. I think there's a perverse aspect on our democracy with the revolving door. I don't think we should go nearly as far as China goes, where they ban Politburo members from leaving the country, except in very rare exceptions. And, Zhu Rongji never joined any corporate boards after he left because he wasn't allowed to. That I think is too extreme, but I do feel like former officials, and I mean, they were both pretty horrible presidents in some very concrete ways, but Richard Nixon and George W. Bush were both exemplary ex-presidents, especially Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon's comments on China and the ways he treated China after leaving office were so much more ethical and so much more beneficial to US interests than Kissinger's were.
Yeah, that's a tough one to crack, but I think I agree. Sort of transparency and disclosures is probably the beginning of it, and a lot of these measures have been strengthened and even put in place in many advanced democracies, like Australia did this recently. I certainly think that's very necessary. So on the self-censorship front, there have been some cases recently where, of course, there, either things appear, posters appear on campus or professors saying things, then the Chinese student organizations react, saying that, these posters, or including in my alma mater, George Washington University, I'm sure you're familiar with this case, where they react to say, like, this is very offensive to us, students from China, please take it down. What, in your mind, what is the biggest problem you see with that kind of argument? Because as kind of an empirical fact, I don't dispute that when at least some Chinese students see or hear criticism, let's say, of China's policies in Xinjiang, they genuinely are offended. They genuinely feel a sense of hurt. Why can't they say that, hey, my feelings are being hurt. Please change what it is that you're doing. What is the problem with that kind of argument when, in fact, they are hurt? They do feel hurt, right? So I do believe that, right?
I think the issue is, so if I'd responded to that question and said, Victor, that question is offensive to me, here's my answer. That's one way of responding. If I say, Victor, that question is offensive to me, you can't ask that question. That I think it's it's where your rights stop and others begin. And I remember when I was an undergrad at Columbia, Edward Said was a professor there. He was a very controversial professor, and he died while I was there. And posters circulated across campus that said God: 1, Said: 0, which is very offensive to people who were supporters of Said. But I think the sort of the response to that, to me, feels like, here's why I disagree. Here's me putting up another poster. Here's how I'm pushing back against what I don't like in your speech, as opposed to, you can't say that. I think the other thing, though, speech policies have changed so much, and I think the Dalai Lama deserves a trigger warning type arguments, which I've seen, I think possibly at UCSD. Is a fascinating rhetorical trick. And I think the way that you push back on that is you have a better rhetorical trick on your side. I do, as we're talking about these things, I do worry about censorship on the other side. I do worry about folks who are pro-Beijing or who support the party or want to praise things the party has done, their inability to do that because they feel like they'll be branded as a friend of China, they'll be branded as a China lover. And I really think it's important that we have a debate, a raucous debate, about how the US should be, about the party's legacy, about how people should view the party. And I think, oftentimes when I have this conversation, people will say, like, well, great, like, so aren't you excited about a unity of approach? And I never want a unity of approach. I always feel like unity is very dangerous because I want people to be able to dissent. I think that's absolutely crucial. I think managed consensus, eventual consensus, raucous consensus is a way to go, but not, oh, you can't say this because this means you're X.
Yeah, the other way of looking at it also is, even if sort of you don't come from a kind of a rights-based tradition where it's like, oh, everyone has equal right. If you come from a more communitarian tradition where, all voices in the community should be valued, by not allowing people to criticize Chinese government policies, which are very repressive on Tibetans and Uyghurs, and maybe some would even say people of Hong Kong and Falun Gong followers, you are not valuing those other members of your community, right? So, in most US campuses, you will have students with Tibetan backgrounds, Uyghur backgrounds, Hong Kong backgrounds, certainly. And if they want to voice their, oftentimes very traumatic experience at the hands of Chinese government policies, you're saying, oh, wait, you can't say that. But then you're basically saying that, oh, well, we think the weight of these members of our community matters more than the weight of these other members of our community. So from a very sort of communitarian perspective, I think there's not a lot of justification, right? So it's one thing to say, like, you personally, you're at fault. Of course, that's, racism and stereotyping that should not be tolerated. But a criticism of government policies, I think, is completely above board. Because even if you don't say, oh, because we all have equal rights, obviously that's true. But the other perspective is because we care about every member of our community equally.
Yeah, I think that's nicely said. Nicely said.
Okay, so a couple more questions before we go to Q&A. So you talk about Hollywood a lot, but in a sense, right, isn't that only kind of a corner of the media market now? Now you've got, so China, of course, now is indeed the biggest market in the world, I think by far now, for movie theater movies, because they, well, until recently, they haven't had to close their movie theaters. But now, people are streaming, there's Twitch, TikTok, and we can talk about TikTok a little bit, but YouTube, As far as I know, in the US TikTok, you can post all kinds of Uyghur stuff and they don't really censor you. So what's really is the concern, when all these new media, they seem to be growing pretty much, outside of influence of China, or do you also detect some kind of pressure even in these newer media?
So I think with TikTok, there's this concept in the military world of fighting last year's war, fighting yesterday's war. And the trick with TikTok is that the implications of the Chinese government having access to all of that data is not yet known, or at least not yet known by me. Perhaps some brilliant people in the AI space can say, oh yeah, this is what it means when this happens. And I do wonder if there's a way to weaponize or inappropriately monetize that data that we're years behind of. And I mean, I think the example of Grindr, Grindr before facial recognition technology and big data was a far less worrisome threat. But if you're able to say, okay, here's a picture of a face, I want to find this picture, through tens of millions of photos, something like Grindr can be a very poignant and pointed blackmail tool if that data falls into the wrong hands, which it very possibly did when Beijing Kunlun owned Grindr. I think in terms of, sort of the general question about Chinese tech companies and innovation, it's a very, very difficult one to sort of figure out where should the United States draw the line. Every company that operates in China has some form of party representation. I think the rules are if you have at least 3 people, you have to have some form of party rep, and it's basically any company that we're talking about here. Plenty of people push back against their party reps. Plenty of people don't, resent them. Plenty of people move in different directions of the party. But I think as we're thinking about decoupling, recoupling, figuring out, okay, this is where we draw the line. This is the level of exposure to Xinjiang. This is the commitment of atrocities that will require this company to be blacklisted. And it's a very hard process. It's a very imperfect process, but I think that's one of the reasons I'm both heartened by the excellent journalism that happens and worried about how closed China has become over the last several years. As I talk to people and they say, oh, why is there not more people-to-people exchanges? And people-to-people exchange is a united front term. It means something specific, but, oh my God, the US and China need to get together and talk. Well, the reason that we're not is that it's almost impossible to go to China right now. And that's because of Beijing's overreaction to COVID. And, when there's a 28-day quarantine in certain parts of the country, that's basically a very clear sign not to go here. I mean, Victor, you probably have friends who are trying to go and you hear stories of $8,000 plane tickets, 3 months in advance. It's very, very difficult to get into China. And that has very real impacts on China's ability to engage with the outside world.
No, our poor students, I mean, some of them have tried for months to buy a ticket back home, just to see their parents. So, yeah, I mean, it is, I can go on and on about the impact of COVID on Chinese students studying here. It's had a very profound impact. So finally, let me ask you a little bit about the China initiative and technology theft. I mean, in a sense, I was a little bit surprised that was not a focus of your book, but of course, we have had other books that have focused on this. If anything, some people may argue that a key mechanism for China to eventually surpass the United States has been technology theft. The China initiative can be seen as a reaction to years and years of this. But of course, it's highly problematic because it really focuses its attention, some would say kind of in an unreasonable way, on Chinese Americans and even foreign researchers who are doing research in the US. What is the best way forward? I know a number of people, Maggie Lewis and so on and so forth, they have their own version. So I wonder what your version is. Now that China initiative is sort of gone, who knows how much it is actually gone. There still are thousands of investigations, right, as the FBI director conveyed. what do you think is a sensible way forward to balance between, the genuine need to sort of protect our technologies, at least as much as possible, but then also protecting actual scientific research and collaboration, which we definitely need, and also not to have paint a bright target on the backs of Chinese Americans.
A couple thoughts on that. First, I'm far more worried about technology that's stolen through hacking or forced technology transfer when a company has to sign a JV with another company. Jeffrey Immelt, the former CEO of GE, talked about doing business in China and seeing engines that were very similar to GE engines, too similar to be anything remotely resembling a coincidence, and costing, I think, $450 million, and him just saying, oh, price of doing business, it was a learning experience. No, this was you getting ripped off, and this was a very clear case of theft. And I think changing the culture, perhaps changing the regulations among US businesses that make it more difficult for them to give technology, that's so much more impactful from US national security and competitiveness than 10 Chinese scientists, whether American or not, putting blueprints illegally in their suitcases and taking them back to China. I think the other big issue is that the universities and the government need to come to some sort of accommodation. What happened with MIT is bad for everyone. It was certainly bad for the scientist who was innocent. It was bad for MIT, and it's bad for the US government. The only winner when that happens is Beijing, really. And I've heard people in the US government say, we've begged universities, give us a scalpel so we don't have to use a hammer. The US government is terrible at taking a light touch. And I'm certainly one who finds it so unbelievably absurd that people still have to take off their shoes to go through airport screening because 20 plus years ago, someone tried to put a bomb in their shoe. And we're still dealing with that now at costs of billions of dollars of lost time and productivity. I find that absolutely insane. And so what we would like to see universities do is do better screening so that you're not accidentally hiring PLA colonels or students who have lied about which university they went to, and they went to the University of International Relations, or they went to some sort of Chinese school where the MSS has a very prominent training program. And I think the issue for so long with both Chinese individuals and arguably even more so Chinese companies is not that they were discriminated against, but that they were given special treatments. The issues with Chinese delistings is not, oh, why is everyone targeting China? It's, oh, why are they not having to follow the exact same audit rules that companies from all over the world have to follow? And so I think the smarter on the back end, it's much easier to say to someone, hey, listen, you lied on your visa application, or you lied on your application, and then ask them questions about it or deny them because of that, than to have to open a investigation into someone who may or may not be innocent, who may have lied on their visa application because they went to this school and have no desire to have any further connection with the MSS. It's just much trickier than the sort of ounce of prevention type idea.
Yeah. Certainly, I think the origin of a lot of this was just universities themselves not paying too much attention to it for years and years and years, and just being super lax about it. Although now the red tape, at least for here at University of California, is getting to be a bit much, but I think it's still better than what it was before, when no one cared what was happening. Okay, so we'll go to Q&A. So we have a couple of questions. Again, if you have questions for Isaac, please post them on the Q&A function. So anonymous attendee says, I have a problem with the term influence. Isn't every country trying to influence others, especially the United States being the biggest economic power in the world? US State Department, both political parties, VOA, USAID, all aim to influence other countries. What's wrong with China trying to influence opinions in the US?
Right. I agree completely. I think every country does that. Every country spies. Every country puts out propaganda. It's what political organizations do. The issue, and usually the way I frame it is, the book is about the pernicious aspects of Beijing's influence in the United States, and focusing on that. I don't think influence in itself is necessarily negative. The difference with China is threefold. So one is China's size. UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey do very similar things, roughly similar things in DC, but China's economy is a lot bigger. Victor, as you were saying before, there's a lot more economic opportunities in China, and so it has a larger influence. The second is that, China is the country that can potentially supplant the United States as a global hegemon. Again, you can think that that's a good thing. You can think that there should be a bipolar world, but from a U.S. interest and U.S. national security perspective, generally speaking, the powers that be disagree with that. And then there's China's domestic repression and the way that extends globally. I'm not going to say China is worse than Saudi Arabia, but it's certainly worse than, Norway. And Norway influences the United States. Norway tries to, exert itself. Japan as well. But, those countries are not committing genocide against their own people. Those countries don't have incredibly repressive political systems. Those countries don't round up dissidents or harass dissidents abroad. So I think part of it is those other aspects of it, as opposed to the term influence in itself being weighted morally positive or negative.
Great. Again, don't be shy. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions. The next question is from Stephen, and he asks, how important is Hollywood in projecting China's discourse power compared to its overt state-sponsored media like CGTN? Its semi-covert foreign influencers and vloggers, or its covert, inauthentic social media operation trolls and bots. Okay, I don't even know what that refers to, but yeah, if you can give us your understanding of what each of these things may be and how influential they may be.
So I think we should distinguish between Beijing's influence domestically in China and then Beijing's influence globally. And if we're just looking at it in China, then state media is the most powerful of all of those. If we're looking at it globally, especially in the Western world, but probably in most countries around the world, then it is Hollywood. Hollywood is so incredibly effective at what it does. And so much of how Beijing has operated on Hollywood has had such a big impact on the movies that we see and sort of our cultural norms. I mean, superhero movies have as one of their antecedents Beijing's unwillingness to offend Chinese people and the pushback that other countries have said, well, why are the bad guys always Russian or always Arab or always Latin? It needs a diversification of bad guys. And instead of doing that, which Beijing was very much unwilling to do, it's, okay, let's create these beasts of no nation. Let's have superheroes of indeterminate ethnicity, except Chinese, of course, they're not Asian bad guys, but bad guys from other parts of the world or other parts of the galaxy, so to speak. I think in terms of the covert work, I'm a lot more worried about, and it's not Chinese misinformation or disinformation. I don't think that's the right framing for this. China has 5,000 years of history, is not propaganda because it's untrue. It's propaganda because it's a political statement that officials make, but it's problematic propaganda because it implies that the Communist Party has a long tenure of history and that its history is anchored back in China's 5,000 years of history. Instead of the idea that, well, actually, like Israel, like Syria, modern China has 70 plus years of history. And compared to the United States, it's a very young country. You get all these comments from Chinese officials, we've been around for 5,000 years where, we have this subtle and sophisticated way of being. It's, well, no, I mean, Israel, Syria, other new countries, you're a new country, that's building off of an old tradition. So I think the worry that I have is less about vloggers, and some do spread information that I find pernicious, but more the way that Americans who are not explicitly tied in with the Chinese state will repeat this information and will talk about China in this particular way.
Great. So we have some questions on the chat function, which I didn't see, from my colleague Ulrike Scheide. So what is the influence of China on the US today? I guess I would say, what are the top things, as we look sort of backward in this post-pandemic world, what is the biggest influence, and is there a way to measure these things?
I think that's a good question. That's a very I think this book was much less quantitative than qualitative, and some of the research and consulting work I do now is a lot more quantitative, a lot trying to figure out what's the percentage of exposure that various US companies have towards China. And I would say that the biggest influence is on the business community in the United States and on various companies that are very dependent on China or feel a dependence towards China, companies like Boeing and Apple and Tesla, and have very serious national security implications and safety implications. I do worry about what's going to happen to Apple's thousands of staff in China if there's a war between the United States and China over Taiwan. I worry not only about how the US will treat Chinese people in America, but I very much worry about how Beijing will treat Americans or people who've worked for American companies in China if ties really degrade to the point where Beijing is very seriously threatening to invade Taiwan or invading Taiwan, and the United States is defending Taiwan against Beijing's aggression.
Yeah, I mean, that's related to a question I have also for you, which is that, and you don't have to mention specific clients, obviously, but what do people say, right, about the role of China in the production process? I mean, is it just irreplaceable for most of your clients, or do they say like, yeah, we can replace China, but it's going to be costly? Or is it, even the best case, I guess, is like, yeah, we can diversify and not accrue too much costs. Which case is it?
So generalizing here, because there's a lot of different cases, nothing is irreplaceable. And I think it's for people who are heavy in the manufacturing, it's incredibly expensive. And it's an incredible loss of convenience, which even a lot of these firms don't price. Sort of I can just call this guy and the factory will make it in 2 days, as opposed to, okay, this is going to take 3 days and I have to drive down this, this dirt road to find it. And I think a lot of the debate too is, every once in a while we'll talk to someone and say, oh, we're diversifying our clothing manufacturing out of China and we're very excited about this new factory we opened in Burma. Like, because Burma is not a national security threat to the United States, but it's, an active war zone, and the government's committing plenty of atrocities against its people. So I think what people are starting to understand is they were too dependent on China, and that's bad from a risk-adjusted perspective. Less even on the question of, is this repressive? Are we complicit? And more that, with the PPE shutdowns, with Beijing's views on COVID and the difficulty of manufacturing, even with all of those things, it's still an incredibly attractive place for people to manufacture, in part because of supply chain efficiencies in Southeast China, and in part because of the huge domestic Chinese market. But I think they're understanding that they really need to broaden that because they could get very, very stuck. So I think that's what we're seeing happening.
Yeah, no, that's kind of my sense. Okay, so final question probably from Funam, one of our students here. Do you think we should be more concerned about China's influence on countries that are in a more financially dire state than the US and are more likely to accept financial aid from China? I'm thinking of places like Pakistan. I'm not denying that China's influence on the US and other Western states shouldn't be studied, but on balance, should we work harder towards stopping the spread of Chinese influence in the global South?
So the United States, like most, if not all countries, is very inwardly focused, and people are much more interested in Beijing's influence here. It feels more real to them than what's happening in Pakistan. And I think that aside, I think it's a very important question about where one sits and what one's trying to do. And I think we can think about this in the context of the war between Russia and Ukraine and all of the complexities and all of the different layers here. So India has been surprisingly supportive of Russia, or at least tacitly supportive of Russia. And part of the reason it does that is because Russia is its most important arms supplier. And why does India need arms? Well, it needs arms to defend itself against China. But it also needs arms to defend itself against Pakistan. But Russia also sells very advanced technology, arguably same level of advancement, to Pakistan and China as it does to India. So India doesn't want to too vociferously push back against Russia because it wants to get the most advanced technology to pull ahead of its rivals or enemies, Pakistan and China. So for all of these things, there's all these little different layers of the onion. And I'd say on balance, Beijing's influence is important everywhere for very different reasons. And that it's good to try to dive in and feel and see, there's a lot about Beijing's influence in Pakistan that I'm very ignorant about, and I'd love to learn more about it. But I think there is a very strong justification for focusing on the US domestically.
Yeah, isn't it kind of like thinking about like what would be happening in Ukraine if Russia had succeeded convincing the United States to not help Ukraine at all today? Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Be a totally different world.
A totally different world. Or sort of the opposite question, what would be happening with China and Taiwan if the US committed to a full-scale military response to Russia? Would that be a signal to Beijing, oh, the US is committed against a very dangerous adversary, so this is a great time for us to seize Taiwan? So there's all these different implications that are very, very difficult to plan for.
Yeah. So before we get into this whole Stephen Kotkin rabbit hole, we better step away from it. It's a bit of a rabbit hole. Thank you very much, Isaac, for joining us. And before we leave, I'd like to say something quickly about our next. Oh, do we have a last? Well, unfortunately, Wenjie, you came in too late, so I'll plow ahead with our upcoming events. So we have a few other exciting upcoming events, including April 7th, rebalancing amid COVID regulations and climate goals with Helge Berger, who's at the IMF. April 14th, we have a hybrid event, so partly in person. Good friend of mine, Isa Deng, talking about public scrutiny and environmental governance in China. April 21st, we have another hybrid event. Another good friend of mine, Rosalie Shih, who's going to talk to us about pathways to globalization in China, India, and Russia. So please join us in these events. You can sign up on our website, china.ucsd.edu. Again, thank you, Isaac, for joining us. I learned a great deal, and I look forward to reading your book.
Thanks for having me, Victor. Great to chat.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.